Good afternoon, everybody. Let me, on the very outset, thank Department of Economics, University of Kerala, and all the conference organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak to you on the topic I've selected for today. It's women in armed forces, the challenges faced by women in armed forces. Small disclaimer, this is a work in progress, and through all the things that I speak about in the paper, I hope to make this better and bigger paper, so I expect all your comments to make it more robust. What I essentially try through the topic is to attempt an outlining of a general nature of national security and strategic narratives, and explore the link between these narratives and economic development, as also explore why it is important for us to discuss the role of women in the above, more specifically in international politics, global peace and security. I'll also briefly flag off certain pertinent questions around the gender barriers in armed forces. We are following from a very interesting and interactive session in the morning, which analyzed very personal and micro detailed analysis of gender working. My paper would be a macro analysis of how gender is placed within a global context, especially in the context of international politics. Allow me to move on to the first section, which outlines the relationship between national security and economic development. How are these two factors related is what I'll be explaining through this section. It's common knowledge that discipline of international relations, it has evolved from its basic premise of studying the political behavior of nation states, which are situated in an anarchic international system. They are constantly in conversation with each other. From that to international politics has grown to integrate global economic and development concerns into the national security framework from hard security concerns such as war making and state making. This has essentially unfolded in the background of globalization, where, for instance, things like foreign direct investment and global financial markets are showing an unprecedented level of interconnectedness, with dense networks of international as well as international dialogues. The resultant change in political policy pertaining to national security is that this particular influence of globalization on international politics has taken things like economic, social, cultural networks into consideration over and above or along with their dominant political and military ones. Under the present framework of globalization, therefore, it is very hard to ignore the role of international institutions facilitating state-to-state collaboration for economic change. The dominant example, or the topic for discussion today, which has been the Sustainable Development Goals, and goal number 5, which is gender equality, can be taken as an example here. This is an example of international intervention by setting certain goals, such as reducing poverty or enabling gender equality. It also becomes a national security goal or a global security goal. Therefore, securing development and developing security, these are syncretic processes when you look at it from the outside. National security also then becomes a precondition for economic and social development, which is the crux of this entire narration, as much as economic and social development is a precondition for national security. Now, every security establishment within a state, be it army, navy or air force, or other institutional security mechanisms that we have today, its ultimate aim is to achieve economic development. If you really talk to them, why are certain institutions securing the borders? Why in the context of probably maritime security, which is my area of study for my research, it secures all the naval establishment is out there to secure the sea lines of communication, so that there is a seamless transition of goods and services across boundaries, maritime boundaries. Now, in the context of land borders are secured to inhibit movement of transnational problematic elements that come via the borders, which is probably detrimental to development and also the smooth running of a nation. Therefore, there is a clear link between national security and development. As national security is derived from national power through tangible markers such as military strength, for example, or role of defense forces or weaponry, it translates to hard power. These are hard power elements in international relations, whereas soft power would comprise of other diplomatic endeavors through which countries stay in constant conversation with each other. Again, international political scenario, as we all know, in most cases of most institutions that we see around us, it's dominated by men making decisions and policies or declaring war and concluding peace. There's absence of a structure of a woman in any of these practices. Further, this is not without exception for sure. There are exceptions to the rule and you do see a presence of women, but not to mark a considerable impact. Further, IR is seen as a matter of interaction between states, which are big entities, rather than what goes on within the states, which is probably what causes the states to have a conversation with each other in the first place. And smaller elements such as citizens, especially how its women are treated. Discussions in IR are steered by those who have little or no consideration for women's experiences and perspectives. So this being a very clear lag in what the discipline entails, it is necessary that we address this particular lag or a gap in the discipline. As has previously been noted, along with the transformation of international relations, like I said, from its excessive focus on conflict and anarchy and a way of practicing statecrafts, formulating strategy that's focused on competition and fear between individual political units such as states, the late 1980s is when we see an evolution of a feminist theory in IR. The IR also expanded from very realist hard security concerns. IR also expanded to include the theoretical aspect of IR, also included things such as study of norms, ideas and processes such as structural violence including poverty, environmental justice, socio-political inequality. And these are things which had been previously left untouched. Many scholars argue that these particular newly evolved smaller units within IR are the root causes of international conflict and security, as opposed to what they previously believed was only competition between states in terms of military might. Alongside deconstructing and subverting masculine bias pervading concepts such as power, security and sovereignty, feminist international relations also worked towards providing an alternative theoretical framework for IR. This particular framework can be distinguished by their ethical commitments to inclusivity in certain structures that you look at today from a hard political concern, and attentiveness to relationships and power-based relationships in particular. It is acutely sensitive to political power and politics in all places within and beyond the conventional boundaries of state and international public spheres. However, this feminist theory in IR is yet to be translated into guidelines for ethical conduct by the state, which follows IR practices and norms, and non-state actors as well in global politics. And there are several reasons for it. One being the exclusion of women from the earlier mentioned hard power concepts. This is, in this context, I try to locate women within armed forces as an analytical category employed by the earlier mentioned feminist IR theorists because their presence is hardly missed from the hard power things. And they only figure in soft power, you understand it, soft power atoms, as opposed to construction of masculinities in militaries, which is both a cause of war or a problem in peacekeeping. Women's narratives have to gain an upper hand. So it's in this context that I present the case of India. Up until the 1900s, the entry of women was limited into the armed services was limited to Army Medical Corps, the Army Dental Corps, and Military Nursing Service. It was only in 1992, as late as 1992, that the first batch of women short service commissioned officer, SSC is a small commission, short service commission as opposed to a permanent commission where they'll be granted service for a set number of years. And in 1992, the first set of non-medical roles, women entered non-medical roles. The tenure of women SSC officers have been since increased to 14 years from then. Government also approved the grant of permanent commission to women SSC officers in Army and in Air Force and Naval capacities as well. The exclusion of women from combat categories is still seen here. It's only in service categories that they are inducted. Especially in the case of Army, where today there are no women in combat category. The Constitution of Women Battalion, and this is my source is coming from a published work by a Major General in Indian Defence Review, where he goes on lamenting about what are the negative effects of having a strong women presence within the armed forces. He says, the constitution of a women battalion in a combat facility is considered preposterous, wasteful, counterproductive, perilous, and he goes on to explain women in many other words, explain women's inclusion in many other words. It's cringeworthy to say the least, but it's surprising that this kind of a narrative also is existing out there. This is all said because it is often being discouraged. Women's participation is often being discouraged, citing their fighting potential. They say women are physically inferior to men, and we've had a couple of debates around this in the session in the morning as well. The proponents of women's exclusion also maintain that women should be inducted in the services only if they add value, or at least I don't know what he means by value here, but whatever value he means, we should be able to add value to the services and not affect it adversely, which followed an analysis of how women bring adversity to the service instead of adding any real value. Allow me to quote this particular writing. About physical standard, he mentions, standard physical fitness of women can never be the same as those of men. It is a biological reality and is true for all fields including sports. In the case of women officers, Indian Army has lowered the standards to apply appallingly low levels. Even then, many women fail to qualify during their pre-commission training. Whereas male cadets are required to run 5 kilometers in 28 minutes, women are given 40 minutes to run the same distance. Similarly, males are required to jump across a 9 feet wide ditch with full equipment and personal weapon. And women have to negotiate only a 5 feet ditch. Worse, most women even fail in this particular test with reduced performance set for them. He goes on further to say about the much lauded SSC enlistment, which has come as a great, success story. He says, short service commission, which is normally extended to 10 years, has proved to be a total waste. It's a counterproductive exercise. Women normally get commissioned at the age of 23 to 25, and this is a manageable age for most women. Within 2 or 3 years of their commission, they also find a partner within the armed services and start a family. And in the 10 years commission that they have, they plan 2 kids. So pre-maternity and post-maternity leave are given. 3 years would go in that, 2 kids, 6 years gone. So out of 10 years that you're in service, you are not actually serving for 6 years. So it's a wasteful enterprise that a woman actually becomes a part of this particular setup, is what this Major General has to say. Coming back, they were not even hesitant to blame, even after adequate reforms, they weren't hesitant to blame the women who made it to the services, citing that even opportunities given were taken in a selective manner. They would take a post and then ask for peacetime operations, and women want to join only as officers and not as soldiers. Additionally, they also claim the concept of equality is given a go-by soon after commissioning. The applications for peace postings, like I mentioned, and other special dispensations proliferate. They join military on the plank of equality of sexes, but this plank vanishes the day they join the training academy, and they keep asking for excuses. Now, all this is written almost a couple of decades almost a decade back. Things have not changed much, but how is the whole figuring of feminist IR theory into this, superimposing that framework onto this, going to be a plan for us to imagine better and emancipating outcomes for women within the structure? That is what I attempt to do in the following sessions. Now, it's common knowledge again that the nature of war fighting has changed from very hard physical tasks like jumping and climbing and lifting heavy things. It's changed to more technologically based warfare these days. So the obsession with this brute physical force has to somewhere stop. But unfortunately, we see the continuation of this in their narratives, in the narratives of people who are advocating exclusion of women from the armed forces. Now, like I said, with the nature of warfighting itself undergoing a massive change and becoming less physically demanding, the entire premise that we just laid out can be debunked. However, it's not. What is their how are they defending that physical capability is still required? They're saying that requirement for physical prowess undoubtedly reduces as the army advances technologically, but this can only be applied in the case of developed countries such as US and UK and countries where a woman in UK can sit, a woman in US can sit and control a drone to Afghanistan, and not in a place like India, which is still pretty labor intensive, which uses still pretty labor intensive methods at war fighting, which I think can be a point of debate here. It's no surprise, therefore, given this thinking, that the armed forces is almost an entirely hostile space for women, even when debates and discussions in addressing this problem are rife. It is in this context that we can review the UN SDG goals. Out of the 9 or 10 odd goals that are given in SDG 5, 3 are particularly important to this particular section that we're discussing now, which is ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision making in political, economic and public life. And clearly we see that there's a huge gap in the political level. To adopt and strengthen sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls at all levels. Tall order to obtain again, I would say. And 3, end all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere. Debatable again. To conclude, I would say, ensuring gender representation and reducing inequality in political institutions, especially the armed forces, must be a key instrument on which the national power itself rests. Because as we have established already, the national security narratives have a very strong connection to economic development. So if you exclude one major component of your population out of that, you are depriving them of a space to partake in the developmental activities. Now, what is the way out, or what can we do to even start rectifying or trying to address these issues? One is we have international best practices laid by other countries, which again is satisfactory to say the least. It's not the ideal goal to go by, but if you keep gender aside and look at poverty alleviation and other things, or strategy and doctrine like hard power concerns, Indian version of Monroe Doctrine has been adopted by Indira Gandhi. There's also Truman and Kennedy and Roosevelt's model being adopted for poverty reduction, emulated by other countries as well. So, towards armed forces inclusion also, we can think of possible best practices around the world. Again, the first step to contesting this exclusionary male-centric approach to understanding of hard power and the exclusion of women from it is to challenge the state-centric approach and the international political system, which is where feminist international relations theory comes to practice and is important. This is also the product of conventional mechanics of IR, that the kind of system that is continuing now, it's probably the outcome of a conventional mechanics of IR. IR will thus remain a prime example of patriarchy as long as it continues to undermine and exclude the lives and views of the female sex. As has already been pointed out through the day in earlier sessions as well, ensuring adequate representation of women in services, not just in armed services but also in policy making, peacemaking, international politics, etc., is essential to maintain a healthy, for lack of a want of a better term, healthy social system or a political system at large. Like ma'am before me, who spoke before me said, we need not be completely, pessimistic kind of a crowd right now, because we are seeing women coming into the forefront. Like from these kind of crude comments, we have advanced to a state where an army regiment, army marching contingent has been led by a woman, and a woman was taking part in the Daredevil motorcycle run and all that. So the aim through this paper was to throw out all these questions and get your views on it, and then think of possible ways to whether or not include women in it. And think of alternatives. Thank you.
Warfare, you should consider women actually more inside the fighting code than health code. Because
good afternoon to all, respected speaker, special invitees, and my dear friends. It's indeed a great honor and a privilege for me to deliver vote of thanks to all those gathered in the second technical session of this one-day national seminar. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation to Bismi Gopalakrishnan, Professor and Dean of Mahatma Gandhi University, for delivering his speech on the topic Constitutionality